Part 1. The missing invitation. The moment people stop inviting you is often the moment they start telling the truth about you. 1 year had passed since Theodore Whitmore's final lesson had changed the course of our family, and for the first time in a very long time, peace seemed to have settled over the Whitmore estate. The summer gardens were thriving, Lily was growing into a thoughtful young woman, and Vanessa appeared different than she once had. She smiled more often now. She listened more carefully. She no longer measured every conversation by what it could do for her. Watching that transformation had been one of the greatest surprises of my life. That was why I found it so strange when something unexpected happened one quiet Thursday afternoon. An ivory envelope arrived in the mail with the embossed gold seal of the Fairfield Country Club, one of the most prestigious private clubs in Connecticut. The Whitmore family had been connected to the club for decades. Theodore had served on committees there. We had attended charity galas, holiday dinners, and countless community events beneath its grand chandeliers. I opened the envelope expecting a routine invitation to the club's annual Spring Heritage Tea, a gathering attended by many of the region's most prominent families. The invitation was addressed to me personally. That alone was unusual. In previous years, invitations had always included immediate family members. I read it twice before setting it down on my desk. Something felt off. That evening Vanessa stopped by the estate with Lily after school. We sat together on the back terrace overlooking the gardens while Lily worked on a sketchbook nearby. During our conversation I casually mentioned the upcoming event. For a brief second I noticed something flash across Vanessa's face. It disappeared almost instantly, replaced by a polite smile. "That sounds lovely," she said. "You should go." I waited. "Are you coming?" I asked. She reached for her coffee cup. "No. I was not invited." Her answer was calm, but not natural. I had lived long enough to recognize disappointment hiding behind composure. "Perhaps there was a mistake," I said. Vanessa shook her head. There was no mistake. The conversation moved on, but the feeling stayed with me. Later that night I stood beside the library window watching rain drift across the lawn. I could not stop thinking about her reaction. Over the following week I noticed other things. Friends who had once greeted Vanessa enthusiastically at social gatherings seemed distant. Several events occurred without her name appearing on guest lists. No one openly excluded her. No one said anything unkind. Yet somehow doors that had once opened automatically now remained closed. The following Saturday I attended the Spring Heritage Tea alone. The club grounds looked as elegant as ever, with blooming flowers lining stone pathways and white tents spread across the lawn. Familiar faces filled the gathering. Conversations flowed easily. Yet as I walked among old friends, I realized something surprising. Nearly every family had arrived together. Husbands, wives, children, and grandchildren mingled beneath the afternoon sun. Vanessa was one of the few people missing. Near the end of the event I joined an old friend named Margaret on the terrace overlooking the golf course. We spoke about family, community projects, and retirement. Then she glanced toward the crowd and asked quietly, "How is your daughter-in-law doing these days?" "Much better than before," I replied honestly. Margaret nodded but offered no further comment. A few moments later she said something I would not forget. "Sometimes invitations stop arriving long before people understand why." Before I could ask what she meant, another guest approached and the conversation ended. But as I drove home beneath gathering clouds, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Someone at that club knew a story I had never heard, and for the first time since Theodore's passing, I felt the familiar pull of a mystery waiting to be uncovered. Part 2. The whispered conversations. The most revealing conversations are often the ones people stop having when you enter the room. Margaret's word stayed with me for days after the Spring Heritage Tea. Sometimes invitations stop arriving long before people understand why. The more I thought about that sentence, the more convinced I became that there was a story behind it. Not a scandal. Not some dramatic secret. Something quieter. Something people remembered but rarely discussed. A week later I returned to the Fairfield Country Club for a charity planning luncheon. The event itself was pleasant enough. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking the golf course, and familiar faces gathered around polished tables decorated with spring flowers. Yet this time I paid closer attention. Several times I noticed conversations shift when certain names came up. One name in particular seemed to create a strange reaction. Vanessa. It happened first near the reception area. Two women were discussing former committee members when I approached. One mentioned Vanessa's name. The other immediately glanced toward me and changed the subject. A few minutes later something similar happened during lunch. A gentleman I had known for years began discussing volunteer events from several years earlier. He mentioned that the club had gone through significant changes in leadership and social culture. Then he paused, looked uncomfortable, and redirected the conversation elsewhere. By the end of the afternoon I was more curious than ever. The following Tuesday I arranged to meet an old acquaintance named Richard Bennett. Richard had served on several club committees over the years and knew its history better than almost anyone. We met for coffee at a small cafe overlooking the harbor. After discussing family and retirement, I finally asked the question that had been bothering me. Richard, why does everyone become uncomfortable when Vanessa's name comes up? He sat quietly for a moment. Because people do not know how much you know. Then tell me what I do not know. Richard sighed and folded his hands. There was never a scandal, Eleanor. That is important to understand. Nobody accused her of anything serious. There was no public incident. No single event. Then what happened? He looked out the window before answering. It happened slowly. I listened carefully. According to Richard, Vanessa had become extremely popular at the club several years earlier. She was successful, polished, confident, and socially skilled. People admired her ambition. She chaired events, attended fundraisers, and built an impressive network. At first everything seemed perfect. But over time patterns emerged. Vanessa often focused her attention on people she considered influential. Conversations with wealthy members received her full enthusiasm. Interactions with quieter members often felt rushed. She remembered the names of executives but sometimes overlooked the names of volunteers. None of it appeared intentionally cruel. Yet people noticed. Relationships work like savings accounts, Richard said. Small deposits matter. Small withdrawals matter too. The words reminded me painfully of Theodore. Richard continued. Over the years some people began feeling invisible around her. Nobody organized against her. Nobody tried to exclude her. They simply stopped feeling connected to her. I sat quietly as everything began falling into place. This was not a story about enemies. It was not a story about jealousy. It was a story about distance. The kind of distance that forms when people feel unseen for too long. Before leaving, Richard offered one final observation. The surprising part is that people have noticed a change recently. They say she seems different now. Kinder. More present. But reputations move slowly. Sometimes it takes years for people to trust what they are seeing. Driving home along the Connecticut shoreline, I thought about Vanessa's transformation during the past year. She truly had changed. Yet perhaps she was only now beginning to face consequences created long before that change began. And for the first time, I started to wonder whether the missing invitations were not a punishment at all. Maybe they were simply a reflection of choices made long ago, choices that had quietly followed her into the present. Part 3, the reputation everyone remembered. People rarely remember a single mistake, but they never forget a pattern. Richard's words stayed with me during the days that followed our conversation at the Harbor Cafe. The more I reflected on what he had told me, the more I realized this situation was far more complicated than a missing invitation. Vanessa had not been pushed out by one dramatic event. She had slowly drifted away from people without realizing it. Still, I wanted to understand exactly how that had happened. A few days later I attended a luncheon hosted by a local historical preservation society. Many longtime Fairfield Country Club members were there, including several people who had known Vanessa for years. I did not go searching for gossip. Theodore had always taught me that there was a difference between understanding people and judging them. I simply listened. What surprised me was how similar the stories were. One woman remembered organizing a charity auction nearly 5 years earlier. She described Vanessa as efficient, intelligent, and remarkably capable. The event had been a success. Yet when she spoke about the experience, there was sadness in her voice. She always knew who the important people were, the woman said. The problem was that the rest of us eventually noticed. Another member shared a similar memory. During a fundraising dinner, volunteers had worked for weeks preparing decorations, coordinating schedules, and arranging guest accommodations. When the event ended, Vanessa had spent nearly the entire evening speaking with major donors and influential guests. She thanked the sponsors publicly. She praised community leaders. Yet many of the volunteers who had done most of the work never received so much as a personal thank you. None of these stories sounded cruel. That was what made them so powerful. No one described insults. No one described public embarrassment. Instead, they described something quieter. They described feeling invisible. As the afternoon continued, I began hearing the same theme repeated again and again. Vanessa had always been polite. She had always followed social rules. She had always appeared gracious. Yet many people felt that her attention depended on what someone could do for her socially or professionally. The realization was difficult because it reminded me of the woman Vanessa used to be before Theodore's final lesson changed her perspective. Back then she often measured success through recognition, influence, and status. She had spent years climbing social ladders without noticing who stood beneath them holding the ladder steady. That evening I sat alone in the estate library, thinking about everything I had learned. Family photographs lined the shelves. Theodore smiled from several frames, surrounded by friends from different backgrounds and different walks of life. One memory suddenly returned to me. Years earlier we had attended a club banquet together. Theodore had spent nearly 20 minutes speaking with a maintenance worker while many prominent guests waited to greet him. When I later asked why, he simply said, "The measure of character is not how you treat the people everyone notices. It is how you treat the people nobody notices." At the time I thought it was simply another one of Theodore's thoughtful observations. Now I understood it was something more. It was the lesson Vanessa had never learned until recently. The following weekend I saw Vanessa at Lily's soccer game. She sat in the bleachers cheering enthusiastically alongside other parents. She seemed happier than she had in years. More genuine. More present. Watching her interact with families around her, I realized something important. The reputation people remembered belonged to the old Vanessa, not the woman sitting in front of me now. The challenge she faced was not changing herself. That part had already begun. The challenge was convincing others that the change was real, and I suspected that journey would be far more difficult than either of us had imagined. Part 4, the woman Vanessa never noticed. Some of the most important people in our lives are the ones we never truly see until it is too late. After my conversation with the longtime club members, I believed I understood the reason Vanessa had gradually lost her place within that social circle. Yet a part of me still felt that something was missing. The stories I had heard explained the pattern, but they did not explain why people seemed to remember it so clearly years later. I found the answer unexpectedly on a quiet Wednesday morning. I had stopped by the Fairfield Country Club to discuss an upcoming historical preservation fundraiser. The meeting ended earlier than expected, leaving me time to walk through the clubhouse before returning home. As I passed the dining room, I noticed a familiar woman arranging flowers near the entrance. She appeared to be in her late 60s and wore the simple navy uniform of the club staff. I recognized her immediately. Her name was Martha. She had worked at the club for more than 20 years. Theodore had always greeted her warmly whenever we visited. To my surprise, she recognized me instantly. We spent several minutes catching up. She asked about Lily. She asked about the estate. She even remembered details about Theodore that many family friends had forgotten. Her memory amazed me. Before leaving, I casually mentioned Vanessa's name. Martha's expression softened. Not angry. Not resentful. Simply thoughtful. She has changed a lot recently, Martha said. I have heard that. Her response caught my attention. You knew her well? I asked. Martha smiled gently. Not really. That was part of the problem. We sat together near a window overlooking the gardens while she explained. For years she had interacted with hundreds of members. Some remembered her name. Some did not. She never expected special treatment. That was not her point. What stayed with her was how different people made others feel. Theodore, she told me, always asked about her family. He remembered when her grandson graduated from high school. He remembered when her husband underwent surgery. He treated conversations with staff members the same way he treated conversations with executives and community leaders. Then Martha said something I would never forget. Your husband made people feel visible. I remained silent as she continued. Vanessa, on the other hand, had rarely been rude. In fact, she was usually polite. But there was often a sense that her attention was elsewhere. During events she focused on guests who could help advance projects, careers, or social connections. Staff members became part of the background. Volunteers became part of the scenery. Nobody felt insulted. They simply felt unnoticed. Most people think respect is about being polite, Martha said. But people remember who truly sees them. Her words struck me harder than any criticism I had heard before. Because they were not spoken with bitterness. They were spoken with understanding. Martha was not describing a villain. She was describing a person who had spent years chasing recognition while overlooking the human connections directly in front of her. Before I left, Martha shared one final memory. A few months earlier, after Theodore's legacy had already begun changing our family, Vanessa had unexpectedly stopped by the club. She was not attending an event. She was not networking. She simply came to deliver donated supplies for a community project. For the first time in years, she had stopped to speak with several staff members. She asked questions. She listened. She remembered names. It surprised all of us, Martha admitted. She seemed different. Driving home through the Connecticut countryside, I thought about that conversation. The missing invitation suddenly made more sense than ever. People had not rejected Vanessa because of one mistake. They remembered years of feeling unseen. Yet for the first time, I also understood something hopeful. The woman they remembered was slowly disappearing. In her place stood someone learning a lesson Theodore had understood his entire life. Every person wants to feel valued. Every person wants to feel noticed. And perhaps the strongest relationships are built not through influence or status, but through the simple act of making another human being feel that they matter. Part 5. What Lily saw. Children often notice truths that adults spend years avoiding. A few days after my conversation with Martha, I found myself thinking constantly about the difference between being respected and being remembered. The more I reflected on Vanessa's past, the more I realized that every lesson seemed to point toward the same conclusion. Yet I still believed there was something I had not fully understood. That missing piece arrived unexpectedly one Saturday afternoon. Lily was spending the weekend at the estate while Vanessa attended a community fundraising event across town. The weather was beautiful, and after lunch we settled on the back terrace overlooking the gardens. Lily brought a box of old photographs she had discovered while helping organize storage rooms in the house. Together we laughed at pictures from family vacations, holiday dinners, and birthday celebrations from years past. Then Lily pulled out a photograph from an event at the Fairfield Country Club. She stared at it for several seconds before speaking. "Grandma, can I tell you something?" Her voice sounded unusually serious. I set down my teacup and nodded. "Of course." Lily hesitated. I think I understood what was happening before anyone else did. The statement surprised me. She was still young, yet there was a maturity in her expression that reminded me of Theodore. What do you mean? I asked gently. Lily looked down at the photograph. When I was younger, I used to go to club events with Mom all the time. Everybody thought everything was perfect. She paused. But sometimes I felt uncomfortable. I listened carefully. Lily explained that as a child she had paid attention to things most adults overlooked. She remembered how her mother could be warm, charming, and enthusiastic with certain people. Yet she also remembered moments when volunteers, staff members, or less prominent guests seemed to disappear into the background. Nobody was treated badly. Nobody was insulted. But Lily noticed that some people received attention while others barely received acknowledgement. I did not know how to explain it back then, she said. I just knew it felt wrong. Her words echoed Martha's observations almost perfectly. Then Lily shared a memory that stayed with me. Several years earlier, after a large charity gala, a volunteer had spent hours helping organize decorations and guest materials. As everyone prepared to leave, the woman quietly packed supplies by herself while prominent guests gathered for photographs. Lily remembered watching the volunteer smile politely as people walked past. She also remembered that her mother never noticed her standing there. I wanted to go thank her, Lily said. But I was embarrassed. Embarrassed? I asked softly. Lily nodded. I was embarrassed because I knew Mom should have thanked her. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Lily said something that broke my heart. I used to worry that I would grow up and become the same kind of person. I reached across the table and took her hand. You never will. At that exact moment we heard footsteps approaching from the garden path. Vanessa had returned earlier than expected. She stopped near the terrace entrance. The expression on her face told me immediately that she had heard enough of the conversation to understand what was being discussed. Lily's eyes widened with concern. The silence felt heavy. Vanessa slowly walked toward us and sat down. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then she looked at her daughter and asked quietly, "Is that really how you felt?" Lily hesitated but nodded honestly. What happened next surprised both of us. Vanessa did not defend herself. She did not argue. She did not explain. Instead, tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "I am sorry." It was a simple apology, but I knew it carried the weight of years. In that moment I realized something important. The people at the club had seen Vanessa's mistakes. Martha had seen them. I had begun to understand them. But the person who had seen them most clearly all along was Lily. And perhaps that was why true change had finally become possible. Part 6, Facing the Mirror. The hardest conversations are not the ones we have with other people. They are the ones we finally have with ourselves. The afternoon after Vanessa apologized to Lily remained unusually quiet. There were no dramatic arguments. No emotional speeches. No attempts to change the subject. For the first time in many years, Vanessa seemed willing to sit with uncomfortable truths instead of escaping them. Over the following week, I noticed subtle changes. She spent less time attending social events and more time at home. She turned down invitations that she once would have accepted immediately. Even her daily routines appeared different. One evening she arrived at the estate carrying a small cardboard box. We sat together in the library while the sun disappeared beyond the gardens. Without saying much, she placed the box on the table and opened it. Inside were photographs, old event programs, newspaper clippings, and awards she had collected over the years. I recognized many of them. They represented milestones she had once celebrated proudly. Business achievements. Charity recognitions. Club committee appointments. Community leadership honors. Vanessa slowly picked up one framed photograph after another. I spent years believing these things proved I was successful, she said quietly. Her voice carried none of the confidence I once associated with her. Only reflection. I remained silent and allowed her to continue. She stared at a photograph from a charity gala held nearly 6 years earlier. The image showed her standing beside several prominent donors, smiling for the camera. Then she pointed toward a volunteer barely visible in the background. I do not even remember her name, she admitted. She probably worked harder that night than anyone in this picture. The realization seemed to pain her more than any public criticism ever could. During the following days, Vanessa began doing something I had never seen before. She started reaching out to people with no expectation of gaining anything in return. She contacted former volunteers from community projects. She wrote handwritten thank you notes. She visited organizations where she had once served on leadership boards and spent time speaking with staff members rather than executives. None of these actions attracted attention. In fact, most occurred quietly and privately. One afternoon she shared something surprising with me. I used to think people stopped inviting me because they were judging me, she said while helping prepare flower arrangements for a local fundraiser. Now I think they were simply responding to who I had become. Her honesty impressed me. Accepting consequences is difficult. Understanding their causes is even harder. A few weeks later, another meaningful moment arrived unexpectedly. Lily invited several classmates to the estate for a small weekend gathering. Throughout the afternoon I watched Vanessa interact with the children. Something about her felt lighter. More present. She listened carefully when they spoke. She asked questions. She laughed easily. Most importantly, she seemed unconcerned with how she appeared to anyone else. At one point Lily pulled me aside near the garden. "Grandma," she whispered. "Mom seems happier lately." I looked toward Vanessa. She was helping one of the younger children decorate cookies while listening to a story that clearly required her full attention. "I think she is," I replied. Lily smiled. "I think so too." That evening, after everyone had left, Vanessa remained behind to help clean up. As we stacked dishes in the kitchen, she suddenly stopped working and looked directly at me. "Do you think Theodore would be disappointed in me?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air for several seconds. I thought carefully before answering. "I think Theodore would be proud of what you are doing now." Tears appeared in her eyes. "Even after everything?" I nodded. "Especially after everything. Because growth means very little when life is easy. Real growth happens when someone has the courage to face their own reflection honestly." As Vanessa stood there in the quiet kitchen, I realized she was finally doing something she had avoided for years. She was looking into the mirror without excuses, without distractions, and without pretending. And for the first time, she seemed ready to become the person she had always wanted others to believe she already was. Part 7, An Unexpected Apology. The apology that changes a life is rarely the one we plan to give. It is the one we never thought we needed to make. Nearly 2 months had passed since the afternoon when Lily finally told her mother the truth about how she had felt growing up. During that time, I watched Vanessa continue changing in ways both large and small. The transformation was not dramatic. There were no grand announcements. No public declarations. Instead, there were dozens of quiet choices that slowly reshaped her relationships. She listened more than she spoke. She asked questions instead of offering opinions. She seemed genuinely interested in people she once would have overlooked. Then one morning she called me unexpectedly. "Would you like to come with me somewhere?" she asked. Her voice carried a nervousness that immediately caught my attention. "Where are we going?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "The country club." I agreed without asking further questions. 40 minutes later we arrived at the familiar entrance. The club looked exactly as it always had. Perfect gardens. Immaculate walkways. Elegant buildings standing beneath bright Connecticut sunshine. Yet something about the day felt different. Vanessa sat quietly during the drive from the estate. As we entered the clubhouse, I noticed her hands trembling slightly. We eventually found Martha arranging floral displays near the main dining room entrance. When she saw us approaching, she smiled warmly. "Good morning," she said. Vanessa returned the smile, but her expression remained serious. "Martha, do you have a few minutes?" Martha seemed surprised but nodded. The three of us moved to a quiet sitting area overlooking the golf course. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Vanessa took a deep breath. "I came here because I owe you an apology." Martha looked confused. "An apology?" Vanessa nodded slowly. "For years I convinced myself that being polite was enough. I thought kindness and attention were the same thing. They are not." Martha remained silent, allowing her to continue. "I spent years walking through rooms full of people without really seeing them. I remembered names when it was useful. I focused on relationships that benefited me. And I ignored people who deserved exactly the same respect." Her voice shook slightly. "You deserved better from me." The sincerity in her words filled the room. There was no performance. No attempt to impress anyone. Only honesty. Martha studied her carefully before responding. "You were never cruel." Vanessa lowered her eyes. "No. But I was careless. Sometimes that hurts people too." Martha smiled gently. "Perhaps." Then something remarkable happened. Instead of dwelling on old mistakes, Martha began talking about recent months. She described hearing from volunteers who appreciated Vanessa's support. She mentioned community projects where people had noticed her willingness to help without seeking recognition. She spoke about small acts of kindness that had gradually become impossible to ignore. Vanessa listened quietly. At one point tears formed in her eyes. "I cannot change the past," she whispered. "No," Martha replied. "But you are changing the future." As we prepared to leave, several staff members passed through the lobby. To my surprise, many stopped to greet Vanessa. Not formally. Not professionally. Warmly. Naturally. The conversations were brief but genuine. Driving home, Vanessa stared through the passenger window for several miles before speaking. "That was harder than I expected." I smiled. "The important things usually are." She laughed softly. Then her expression became thoughtful. "You know what surprised me most?" "What?" I asked. Nobody wanted revenge. Nobody was waiting to embarrass me. Most people simply wanted to be treated like they mattered. I nodded because she had finally reached the same conclusion Theodore understood throughout his entire life. Human beings remember how they are made to feel. They remember respect. They remember attention. They remember kindness. And sometimes the most powerful apology is not a speech at all. Sometimes it is the decision to become a different person. As the estate appeared in the distance and the afternoon sun settled over the rolling Connecticut landscape, I realized that Vanessa had finally stopped trying to repair her reputation. Instead, she was repairing something far more important. Her character. And unlike social status, that was something nobody could ever take away from her. Part 8, the invitation she did not expect. The moments that mean the most are often the ones we never see coming. Autumn arrived quietly across Connecticut. The giant oak trees surrounding the estate had begun turning shades of gold and crimson, and the air carried the familiar crispness that Theodore always loved. Nearly a year had passed since the first signs of change began appearing in Vanessa's life. Looking back, I could hardly recognize the woman who had once measured success through status, influence, and social recognition. Yet the greatest test of transformation is not what happens when people are watching. It is what happens when nobody owes you anything. One Thursday afternoon, Vanessa stopped by the estate carrying several folders related to a community literacy project she had been helping organize. We spent an hour reviewing volunteer schedules before she prepared to leave. Just as she reached the front door, her phone rang. I noticed her expression shift from curiosity to surprise. "Hello," she answered. A few seconds later she froze completely. "Really?" she asked. I was not expecting that. After ending the call, she stood silently in the foyer. What happened? I asked. Vanessa laughed softly, still appearing stunned. I just received an invitation. To what? She shook her head in disbelief. The annual Winter Heritage Gala. For a moment I simply stared at her. The Winter Heritage Gala was one of the most respected events in the region. Community leaders, philanthropists, educators, volunteers, and long-time residents attended every year. More importantly, invitations were extended carefully. Attendance was based largely on reputation and contribution rather than social status. Vanessa sat down in the nearby living room, still processing what had happened. I thought those invitations stopped years ago, she admitted. They did, I said gently. That is why I am surprised. A few days later the official invitation arrived by mail. The envelope contained not only an invitation but also a handwritten note from one of the event organizers. Vanessa read it several times before finally handing it to me. The message was simple. It thanked her for her work supporting local educational programs and community volunteers throughout the previous year. It specifically mentioned her willingness to contribute behind the scenes without seeking recognition. As I watched her read those words again, I realized something important. The invitation had not arrived because people forgot the past. It arrived because they noticed the present. When the evening of the gala finally arrived, I accompanied Vanessa and Lily to the event. The venue was beautiful, decorated with seasonal greenery, warm lights, and elegant holiday displays. Yet what struck me most throughout the evening was not the event itself. It was the people. Again and again, individuals approached Vanessa to thank her. Teachers thanked her for supporting literacy initiatives. Volunteers thanked her for showing appreciation. Community members thanked her for helping organize projects that benefited local families. None of these conversations focused on social status. None involved business opportunities. They were expressions of genuine gratitude. At one point during the evening, Vanessa excused herself and stepped onto an outdoor terrace overlooking the gardens. I joined her a few moments later. You seem overwhelmed, I said. She smiled. I am. Then she looked toward the ballroom windows where guests continued laughing and talking inside. The strange thing is that a year ago this invitation would have meant everything to me. And now? I asked. She thought carefully before answering. Now it means something completely different. I understood exactly what she meant. Once, she would have viewed the invitation as proof of acceptance. Proof of status. Proof of importance. Now she saw it as something else entirely. It represented trust. Respect. Relationships. The very things Theodore valued most. As we stood together beneath the autumn stars, Lily joined us and slipped her arm around her mother. Vanessa smiled and wrapped an arm around her daughter. Looking at them together, I realized that the invitation itself was not the reward. The real reward had already arrived months earlier. It was the family she had rebuilt, the lessons she had embraced, and the person she had become. Everything else was simply confirmation that others could finally see it too. Part 9, Why They Stopped Inviting Her. The answer turned out to be far simpler than any of us expected. Several weeks after the Winter Heritage Gala, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The estate was peaceful. Lily was thriving. Vanessa continued dedicating her time to community projects, not because she wanted recognition, but because she genuinely cared about the people involved. One Sunday afternoon, our family gathered for lunch beneath the large oak trees behind the estate. The weather was unusually warm for late fall, and laughter drifted across the lawn as relatives shared stories and memories. Watching everyone together, I found myself thinking about the question that had started this entire journey. Why had the country club stopped inviting Vanessa in the first place? We had uncovered pieces of the answer through conversations with members, volunteers, staff, and friends. Yet I realized nobody had ever stated it plainly. Later that afternoon, after most of the guests had gone home, Vanessa and I remained on the terrace overlooking the gardens. Lily sat nearby reading while golden sunlight stretched across the lawn. The conversation turned naturally toward the past. "Do you ever think about those years?" I asked. Vanessa smiled softly. "More often than you might imagine." She paused for a moment before continuing. "I used to believe people stopped inviting me because they disliked me. I waited quietly. Then I thought it was because they were judging me for mistakes." She looked toward the trees where leaves moved gently in the breeze. "Now I think neither explanation was completely true." That answer surprised me. "What do you mean?" Vanessa folded her hands together and reflected for several seconds. "I think they stopped inviting me because being around me stopped feeling meaningful." Her honesty struck me immediately. She explained that for years she had approached relationships as transactions. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. Simply habitually. She focused on outcomes, opportunities, influence, and appearances. She paid attention to people who seemed important while unintentionally overlooking others. As a result, many interactions remained pleasant but shallow. "People were not angry," she said. "They just never felt connected to me." The more she spoke, the more I realized how accurate her conclusion was. Nobody had organized against her. Nobody had excluded her out of cruelty. Invitations gradually disappeared because relationships gradually weakened. The connection simply faded. At that moment Lily closed her book and joined the conversation. "Can I tell you what I think?" she asked. Vanessa smiled. "Of course." Lily thought carefully before answering. "I think people invite the people who make them feel good about themselves." Neither of us spoke. The simplicity of her observation carried remarkable wisdom. Lily continued. "Grandpa always made people feel important. Grandma does too. Now you do that more than before." Vanessa laughed softly. "That is a much better explanation than mine." But I knew Lily had identified something essential. Human beings naturally gravitate toward those who make them feel valued, respected, appreciated, and understood. Status may attract attention. Wealth may attract admiration. Success may attract curiosity. But genuine human connection creates lasting relationships. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the estate, I thought about Theodore. He had understood this truth long before any of us. Throughout his life he treated the newest volunteer with the same respect he offered community leaders. He remembered names. He remembered stories. Most importantly, he remembered that every person wanted to feel seen. Perhaps that was his greatest lesson. Not one written in a speech or preserved in a family document, but demonstrated through everyday actions. Vanessa seemed to reach the same conclusion. "I spent years trying to be impressive," she said quietly. "Then I discovered people would rather feel appreciated." We sat together in comfortable silence. Looking around at the estate, at Lily, at the family that had grown stronger through difficult lessons, I realized the story had never truly been about invitations. The invitations were only symptoms. The deeper lesson was about relationships. About character. About the difference between being noticed and being valued. The country club had stopped inviting Vanessa because people did not feel connected to her. They started welcoming her again because she finally learned how to connect. And in the end, that lesson became worth far more than any social status she had ever hoped to protect.